Hyakumonogatari, 100 Spooky Stories. Story number 79, Sheltered at My Grandparents' House, by For as long as I can remember, my grandparents have been a massive part of my life. Some of my earliest memories are snippets of time with them. I would go so far as to call them my second set of parents, really. My parents worked full-time, and I have no older siblings who could have watched after me. Because of this, my grandparents would pick me up after school, and I would stay at their home until one of my parents got off work. Even in the summer, my parents would drop me off at their place for the day. I honestly never minded it, however. Even as I got older, I would rather spend time with them than stay at home by myself. They lived on a quiet street just a 5-minute drive from my house. Their pleasant, open-concept, 2-floor house was a comfortable size and was surrounded by a good amount of yard for me to play in. There were no other kids on the street. Still, I kept myself entertained with my curiosity and imagination, always running around with small toys, trinkets, and whatever else I found on the ground. My grandparents would always encouragingly feed into my interests and ambitions by playing along or providing something that would help. My grandparents had a very loving relationship. They were always very close, and I do mean that in a literal sense. Wherever one was, the other was sure to appear shortly after them. Never before had I seen two people be so attached at the hip. Some days, they would drop whatever they were doing to rush the three of us out of the house for some fun, outdoor time. Once they ushered me outside, my grandparents might play games with me, or watch me play from the steps, holding each other lovingly. My grandfather was always the playful one. He would always play this game with me that I affectionately referred to as the coin game. He would usually surprise me with a "think fast" and flip a coin off his thumb at me. It was my job to catch it quickly before it hit the ground. Once I got older, I would try flicking it back at him to see if I could catch him off guard. However, he was way better at the game than I was. We would also play together in the yard or build different things. He would mess with me sometimes with his little pranks here and there. He always kept things interesting and kept me on my toes. My grandmother was the more practical of the pair. She was privy to the simpler things and was a little more traditional. Crafting, cooking, gardening. She had a lot of valuable skills to teach me in my youth. Despite not having a formal education, she was exceedingly erudite and made for stimulating conversation. She was exceptional at the card and board games I brought the three of us to play. Sometimes, I feel guilty that my need to be entertained may have disrupted my grandparents' lives. But I think for the three of us, life was lonely. They had their friends, as did I. Yet being with each other gave us a sense of consistency that didn't verge on monotony. It gave us something to do, someone to talk to, a reason to get out of bed in the morning maybe. I was usually the only one who ever visited them. I don't have any other siblings to pay them mind. Except for Christmas, my aunt and cousins never really visited. My parents were always working and didn't want to intrude on my grandparents' day off from babysitting. To be quite honest, I was under the impression that my father had a strained relationship with them. I recall one evening, he and my grandmother went into the upstairs main bedroom. While collecting my playthings in the toy room next door, I overheard them having a relatively heated discussion. I could only make out what my dad said as I attempted to listen in.
"You know that he loves visiting you. I don't care what Tammy does."
Tammy is my aunt.
"We won't abandon you and leave you isolated, Mom."
I scampered away on soft footsteps before anyone could notice my presence. My grandmother's paranoia about me leaving her behind didn't make sense to me at the time. From then on, I made extra sure to give her and my grandfather equal attention when I visited, just in case. She never personally gave me any indication that she harbored these feelings. Sometimes, though, when she would smile softly at me, there was something in her eyes, a look of mourning. As I grew up, I started to notice that my grandfather had a similar expression at times. What are they so sad about? I couldn't help but wonder to myself. For one reason or another, in my young mind, I rationalized that it must have been because I wasn't a little kid anymore, or at least what I perceived as a little kid at the time. I became aware that we were all growing up. One day they wouldn't be able to do the same things with me as they once did. Tragically, that day came earlier than I expected. It was the middle of October, during my junior year of high school. I came out of school shocked by what I saw waiting for me by my usual meeting spot. It was my mother. I remember hastening my pace into a quick jog. "Mom, why are you here?" I don't remember how I ended up in the back seat of her car. I was too busy waiting for whatever my mom could possibly need to say to me. She started to stumble on her words. She didn't want to tell me in the car, but she didn't want to do it in public or keep me waiting, so this was the best option. In an awkward but well-meaning way, she spoke. "Your grandfather collapsed from a stroke just a little while ago. We're not sure what happened." "Is he—" I trailed off as my eyes began to well up. "We don't know how he is right now. We're waiting for the news." Everything from then on was a blur. Hours rolled by while I kept waiting for something. I don't recall what I did. I was too distracted. My dad stayed up all night near the phone. I stayed up too without us knowing. 2:20 a.m. The phone rang. I got close to the staircase, my hands stifling my whimpers as I listened in, pleading. It was not long after the ring that I heard my father. Thank God. I pulled myself off the banister and sprinted down the stairs as if it were Christmas in hell. My father pointed a finger upwards in my direction as if telling me to wait. My dad's more relaxed expression was the only thing keeping me silent, as he then turned back toward the phone. After several okays and rights, he hung up the phone and filled me in on their conversation. My grandfather was stable, but had suffered notable brain damage. There was some physiotherapy he could undergo, but some side effects would be permanent. Throughout the coming days, I learned more about his condition. The right side of his body was paralyzed. He would likely need a wheelchair to move around. He could no longer speak. I remember crying as I saw him wheeled out of the hospital. I hugged him and accepted that this would be part of our new life. I was still able to visit my grandparents, excluding the days my grandfather had to go to appointments. My parents came a little more into my life after that, now picking me up more from school and helping at my grandparents' place. It was nice, but not at this cost. The most noticeable change was that my visits with my grandparents felt more unrelaxed. My grandfather would still try to play the coin game with me. However, he no longer had the fine motor skills to flip the coin as he once did. Instead, he would fling it awkwardly by whipping his unusable arm. Since he could no longer announce a surprise attack, I would sometimes feel the coin smack me on the back if I wasn't paying attention. Other times, I would hear the ding of the coin striking the wall or the floor. As I approached him, I could see the sadness in his widened eyes. Gone were the days of satisfying victory. I placed the coin on my thumb when I was inches from him. "Here, it's your turn to catch." I then gently flipped the coin back into his hand. I gave him a reassuring smile, which he attempted to mimic with his hindered facial muscles as best he could. Despite his inability to play the coin game with me, I found we played it more frequently. Sometimes, he would toss multiple coins when his aim was incredibly off. Sometimes, he would ring his little service bell in a frenzy and pelt coins at me until I picked them up or begged him to stop. Sometimes it hurt. I hated it when he did that. I still flinch when I hear those bells to this day. I chalked it up to a frustrated refusal to let this condition inhibit his life. That, or his memory could be going. I hoped for the former. Nonetheless, even my grandmother was more out of sorts than she had been in the past. She didn't mind caring for my grandfather, but she vehemently hated that wheelchair for some reason. She frequently cursed under her breath about how slow it was or how it struggled with maneuvering. I never understood why it mattered so greatly to her, so long as my grandfather was comfortable. Additionally, I found her very easy to startle whenever I approached her. She would save face every time, but I knew better. In contrast, once we were together, she became very clingy and would always hover nearby. Come to think of it, I don't know if she was ever not in my line of sight, unless I was with my grandfather. I refused to allow myself to be annoyed by their reaction to this misfortune, even if it was a lot to handle emotionally as a teenager. But in about 8 years' time, I would finally learn why I should have left them alone. I was 23 years old. I had graduated from university and was working my first full-time job. I still visited my grandmother as much as I could. Yes, I did only say grandmother. I still don't like thinking about it. She was feebler now, but had adapted well to her new life of solitude. She kept herself busy and in touch with friends and family. But one day, the day that would be the last time I visited, I was helping her clear out some heavier things she needed to dispose of. I had just finished removing an old end table from the crawl space upstairs when I saw her in the corner of the hallway. "Grandma, there's another table like this in the back of the storage. Is that one broken too?" She began making her way toward me in a rigid fashion. Suddenly, I heard a scream come from the bottom of the stairs. "Drop it and get down here, now!" It was my grandmother. Confused, I turned back to the woman I was talking to, who was not inspecting the table as I expected. She instead bore her gaze on me. As she got closer, her features began to distort and darken. I don't think I can aptly describe what kind of evil I saw in the face I loved for so long. Nevertheless, it was enough to bring me to my senses as I raced down the steps, and my grandmother, grabbing me by the hand, pulled me outside, slamming the door behind us. I didn't realize until I looked back at the shut door that the demon had caught up to us so quickly that an outline of its face was only beginning to dissipate from the entryway window. Shocked and mortified, I looked back at my actual grandmother, who was also out of breath. She apologized profusely and explained that it was time she gave me some proper answers. "What the hell are you talking about? What was that thing?" "I don't know." She paused. "Your grandfather and I dealt with it for years, ever since we were slightly older than you are now." "Why didn't you leave if this thing's been in your house this whole time?" "We tried to leave it behind, but it followed us here. This is our third house. It's been with us since we moved into our first home together." "How dangerous is it?" "We never dared to find out." A silence hung in the air, both of us trying to find our following words. My grandmother eventually broke the silence before I could. "I can only give you some advice. It likes to show itself to people who are completely alone. Even if someone so much as turns a corner to leave you alone in a room, you can't be sure who will be re-entering. If you're ever unsure, you can use these." She handed me a small, greenish cloth bag before frantically continuing. "It's not solid, so if it can't pick things up, or if those pass through them, you'll know. Luckily, it also can't open or pass through closed doors, it seems. That's the only way we could figure out how to dispel it temporarily. Mind you, that is trickier in our home, but it shouldn't be as hard for you." "For me?" My grandmother sighed as I tried to look into her sorrowful, downcast eyes. "When your grandfather first acknowledged it, only then did it start to go after him, too. Since you saw it, I don't know what that means for you, but it might not attach itself to you since you don't live here yourself." Her expression turned to one of shaky anger. "I tried to tell your father to stop bringing you here. I couldn't give him a sound explanation why, for obvious reasons. It's stubborn." She began to break down in tears. As I hugged her, she continued through squeaks and gasps. "He called us senile and crazy and got mad at Tammy for feeding into it. Tammy only believed us because she saw it as a child. We just wanted to protect you." Once she said that, I dissociated from the conversation as my mind played back all the memories from my childhood. The sudden outdoor adventures, my grandparents always being together, the argument she had with my father, my grandmother's jumpiness when she had to leave my immobilized grandfather, the lack of visits from my cousins. My entire picturesque childhood was a lie. Now that you know, my grandmother snapped me back to reality. Please, never visit me again. We can still see each other away from here, but do not come back. For both our sakes. But what about you? I stammered. You're still in danger. She shook her head with confidence. If I see anyone in my house now, I'll know who it is. After our heartfelt and teary goodbyes, I hopped in my car and looked at my accursed haven one last time before looking back at my grandmother. With tear-stained face, she shouted out to me. I'm sorry. It's not your fault. I love you, I shouted back, blowing her a kiss. I saw her mouth the words I love you back, but failed to hear it over the sound of the engine starting as she kissed her hand and waved. As I reversed and began to head off, our eyes were locked onto each other until the neighbor's hedges obstructed my view. I drove to the end of the street, coming to my final realization. My grandfather, unable to move quickly in his wheelchair, never once felt victory at the sound of a coin digging the floor or at the sight of it whizzing past me. As I somberly and silently walked toward him to take my shot, those widened eyes held no sadness. I witnessed pure, unadulterated terror. I broke down, knowing I unknowingly tormented the man I loved so much with my presence in his final years. For anyone wondering, I did see my grandmother multiple times in the 2 years following my final visit. However, since then, I have moved to a larger city to pursue better employment and genuinely start my adult life. I was alone in my apartment's bedroom, waiting for my fiancé to come home from work when my cell phone rang. It was my mom. She prepared me for some bad news and proceeded to inform me that my grandmother had passed away. One of my grandmother's neighbors called for a wellness check after she hadn't been seen for a few days and stopped responding to calls. The police found her deceased in her bed and presumed she died peacefully in her sleep. My mother apologized as my father wanted to be the one to call me, but he was apparently not taking things well. We spoke a little more about various details and hung up. Despite my violent sobs in my pillow, I was relieved to hear my grandmother hadn't suffered. I finally saw a bit of my fiancé's shoulder as he seemingly rummaged around the opposite end of the kitchen. About to run crying to him for comfort, I got all of about 2 steps when I suddenly froze. I stood, shaking and sobbing, confused by my own reaction. My tears momentarily stopped as I sobered up, acknowledging something nagging me from the back of my mind. I began retracing my steps, accidentally stumbling into my nightstand in the process. I opened the drawer and felt around, still staring at the person who had straightened his back by this point. From the drawer, I retrieved a small cloth bag, its contents not worth very much, but worth everything to me. As I heard steps come in my direction, I pulled out a coin.